Brooklyn, where I'm from. All right, so we're actually going to get started now. So thanks again. My name is Ofrana Mabu. I'm the Senior Research Associate with the Building Movement Project. And thank you so much for joining us on this webinar, Race to Lead Women of Color in the Nonprofit Sector. As I mentioned earlier, everyone is in listen-only mode. So that means that we can't see or hear you, but what you can do is submit a question using the chat box function. Please use the chat box function to submit a question. And at the end, we have a Q&A part and we'll get to as many questions as we can. But if we don't get to your question, I'll put up my email address, so you're welcome to reach out to me. And I do want to mention that we are recording the webinar, so if there's something that you missed, you'll definitely have access to it. So I do want to announce that today we're launching a new social media campaign specifically for the Women of Color Report. So what we're asking is that if you have a story you want to share about being a woman of color, working in the nonprofit sector, or if you have a suggestion for the nonprofit sector, please join us on social media. Our Twitter and Facebook handles are @BuildingMovement, and our hashtags are WOC Equity, which stands for Women of Color, Remake the Table, and you can also use the hashtag Race to Lead as well. So here's our agenda for today. So first, I will tell you about Building Movement Project and the Race to Lead report series. Then I'll transition into describing the findings from the Women of Color report. Then we're very excited to have 2 respondents who will share their thoughts and experiences, as well as some recommendations on what the nonprofit sector can do to address some of the challenges identified in the report. And then we will have the Q&A section, of course. So today's presenters, so I am again Ofrana Mabu, the Senior Research Associate at the Building Movement Project. We have Kelley Robinson, the new Executive Director of the Planned Parenthood Action Fund, and Sandra Gasca-Gonzalez, who is the Vice President for the Center for Systems Innovation at the Annie E. Casey Foundation. So I do want to get a sense of who is in the room. So we are going to launch a poll for you here, which you should all see right now, which is, what is your current or most recent role? Are you a consultant, self-employed? Are you entry-level staff, mid-level staff? Maybe you're a senior staff or a director. Perhaps some people are board members, or you have some other role. So please participate in the poll. We'll give you a couple seconds to fill that out, and then we'll share results. It'll be really helpful for us to get a sense of who's in the room. All right, so I'm going to share the results right now. It looks like the majority are mid-level and senior level staff. We've also got a good 12% and 10% who are entry consultants, as well as entry level. And then we got 2% who are board members. So thanks so much for participating in that poll. And I'll just share one last poll with you, which has to do with some of the questions we're exploring around how your organizations are approaching questions of equity. So the question here is, what type of conversations does your organization have when it comes to equity? Do you talk about race alone, but not gender? Or do you work in a place that talks about gender, but not race? Do you talk about both? Do you talk about race and gender combined? Or are you working in a place that hasn't really dived into any of these questions yet? So if you could please fill out the poll, we'll give everyone a couple more seconds. All right, I'm going to end the polling right now and share the results. So it looks like most people, 65% are working in places where both race and gender are a topic of conversation. And then a smaller group, about 20%, talk about race but not gender. Another 6% talk about gender but not race, and 10% aren't talking about any of these issues at all. So it looks like about a third are looking to see if more conversations could be had about race and gender combined. All right, thank you so much for filling that out. That was very helpful. So now I'll tell you about the Building Movement Project. So Building Movement Project is a national research organization that provides resources and tools to help push the nonprofit sector and support the nonprofit sector doing more work around social change. So we operate in 3 areas, going from right to left: movement building. So that's acknowledging and building on the distinct role that nonprofits have in advancing social change movements. Second, we also work on service and social change, which means developing the capacity of organizations to engage constituents around addressing the root causes of the conditions they're facing. And then finally, leadership, looking at how organizations can do their best work when they have effective and inclusive practices and look at issues of equity. So that's where the Race to Lead research comes in. So back in 2016, the Building Movement Project decided to engage on a topic that has been of concern in the nonprofit sector for a long time, which is why there are so few leaders of color in the nonprofit sector. So there have been many surveys, many reports documenting the lack of leaders of color in the nonprofit sector. Board Source, Compass Point, and others have shown that there are few people of color on the boards of nonprofits and also few people of color leading nonprofits. So recognizing that this isn't a new question, what Building Movement Project wanted to know in 2016 is why things haven't shifted, despite the fact that there were this increased number of training programs that were supposed to move and improve that condition, as well as a number of organizations and groups that have moved into the space of addressing race and race equity. Why were there still not more leaders of color in the nonprofit sector? So BMP launched a survey in 2016. It was a nationwide survey, and over 4,000 people from around the country responded who work in the nonprofit sector. And the results really place responsibility around the assumptions and the structures that guide decision makers. So the first overall finding is that people of color aspire to lead nonprofits more than their white counterparts. These are folks who weren't already in a CEO or executive director role, but wanted to be one day. The other big finding was that people of color were just as qualified as their white counterparts when that comes to education and years in the sector, just as qualified. But finally, it's systemic barriers that are the cause of the lack of leadership of color in the sector. Things like boards of directors not being supportive of people of color who are leading organizations, or people who have hiring decision-making power, so recruiters or hiring managers, using terms like cultural fit as an excuse to exclude people and really to discriminate. So after that survey, Building Movement Project produced 4 reports. The first was the overall report that you can find on our website, racetolead.org. There was also a report looking at intersectionality, a report focused on LGBTQ, people of color respondents. And then there were 2 reports that looked at regional issues, so Massachusetts and California. So you can find all of those on our website. So the first national report compared people of color and white nonprofit staffers and leaders. But we know that gender can have an impact on our results and sometimes even mask some of the differences that we see. So for the past several months, we've been working on a new report that takes a look at women of color. We know that women of color are a very valuable and important part of the nonprofit sector. We want to know if they're being supported and how. So specifically, we asked, how does the intersection of race and gender impact the career advancement and the experiences in the nonprofit sector for women of color? So our methodology for this latest study included that Race to Lead survey of over 4,000 respondents. We also did focus groups last summer. So we went to New York City, we went to Albuquerque, New Mexico, Raleigh, North Carolina, Tampa, Florida, Portland, Oregon. We did these focus groups so we could dive deeper and learn more from folks when we presented this data to them. These focus groups were specifically for women of color, for white women, for CEOs of color, and for white CEOs. And we also had a men of color focus group in New York City. And then finally, we did some in-depth interviews with 10 participants. These were mainly folks who were from groups that were underrepresented in the survey. So as I mentioned, we went back and analyzed the Race to Lead survey using a race and gender lens. You can see the demographics here on your screen. So the majority of the respondents were women, 46% were white women, and 32% were women of color. 10% identified as white men and 9% were men of color. 1% were trans and or gender nonconforming people of color, and 2% were white, trans, and or gender nonconforming folks. So if you look at the women of color respondents, there were 1,200, and the largest group were Black women, 35%. Then you have 22% who identified as Latinx, 21% multiracial or other race, 19% Asian or Pacific Islander, and 3% who said they were Native American or Indigenous. So I'll share our findings from the Women of Color report. So our first finding was that the intersection of race and gender means that women of color face the barriers to advancement over and above what white women and as well as men of color are experiencing. So as I mentioned, that first report showed that people of color aspired to lead nonprofits more than their white counterparts. And you can see the same when you look at it from a race-gender perspective. So you can see that almost half of women of color who weren't already executive directors wanted to be one day. If you compare that to the 40% of white women and the 43% of white men. And here was men of color who were the most likely to say that they wanted to lead a nonprofit. 54% said so. Yet despite the leadership aspirations of people of color, race poses as a barrier, especially for women of color. So the survey asked questions about how race played into advancement for folks. And they were asked, did race have a positive impact, no impact at all, or a negative impact? And you can see for women of color in this first column, they were the most likely to say that race had a negative impact on their career advancement. 36% of them said so, compared to 28% of men of color. Similarly, the survey asked about the impact of gender on career advancement. And here again, you can see that 30% of women of color said that gender had a negative impact on their career advancement, compared to 25% of the white women respondents. So hundreds of survey respondents were able to enter write-in responses describing how race and gender had a negative impact on their career advancement. And what we saw was that women of color described being passed over or overlooked for promotions, for new jobs, and favor folks with fewer qualifications. And the women of color observed that white men tended to advance faster, and white women as well, even if they were underqualified and were given more professional development opportunities. They also saw that amongst men of color. They wrote that directors did not see women of color as leaders and tended to withhold projects and advancement opportunities. So you can see here a quote from a Black woman survey respondent who said that when the leadership of her organization identifies and grooms someone to be the face of the organization, that person is white, that person is male, and that person is heterosexual. Women of color who worked in either a people of color or immigrant identity-based organization or another identity-based organization, like let's say a women's organization or an LGBTQ organization, were more likely to say that race had a positive impact on their career advancement, more so than those who worked in a non-identity-based organization. And when we shared this at the focus group, what women of color in the race or ethnic group or immigrant identity-based organization said was that their race and ethnicity helped them better understand and serve the constituents that their organizations were working with. What was also interesting was that women of color who worked in people of color or immigrant identity-based organizations were more likely to say that gender had a negative impact on their career advancement, more so than women of color in non-identity-based organizations. So the women of color and people of color or immigrant identity-based organizations said that men were viewed as the leaders in those sectors and that they tended to ascend faster to leadership roles. And the women of color expressed disappointment that their organizations that were so progressive on race were less so and really fell short when it came to gender issues. So here's a quote here from a survey respondent who identified as Latina and said that working in a space where immigrant and labor rights intersect, leadership hasn't taken kindly to her stepping in as a woman. Our second finding has to do with education and training. So although education and training are typically thought of as great strategies for people of color to advance, it really isn't enough to close the gap. So here's a look at the educational attainment of the survey respondents. And there weren't any significant differences between the educational attainment of women of color, men of color, white women, and white men. So basically they're equally qualified. But you did see a difference in the roles that people have. So here are the survey respondents who have a master's degree or more, and women were significantly less likely to hold a CEO or a senior management position. So 57% of women of color in blue were in a CEO or senior management role with a master's degree or more, and 59% of white women were in that role. And you can compare that to 71% of men of color and 75% of white men. What you also see is that 1/4 of the women of color with a master's degree or more, these highly educated women of color, were in line or admin staff positions. And that's also followed by 21% of white women, 15% of men of color, and just 12% of white men. And that matters because we know that women of color really aspire to lead nonprofit organizations one day. You saw that salary differences also emerged amongst the survey respondents despite comparable levels of education. So in the survey, participants were asked to report their salary. We grouped them into these big buckets here. And you see again the race and gender differences. So white men with a master's degree or above are the most likely to earn $100,000 or more. Next, 9 percentage points less for men of color at 29%, 19% of women of color, and 15% of white women. In contrast, you see that women with a master's degree or more were more likely to be in the lowest salary range of 0 to 50,000. You see 28% of women of color in that position and 30% of white women. Next, 24% of men of color and 18% of white men. And the differences in salary persist even among participants in the highest level roles. So when you look at executive directors or CEOs with a master's degree or above, almost a quarter, 23% of women of color were in the lowest salary range of 0 to 50,000. Next after that were men of color, 17% of them, 16% of white women, and just 8% of white men. So differences also emerge around the feelings people had about salary and promotional opportunities. So women of color with a master's degree, as you can see that bottom column set of columns there, women of color with a master's degree were the most likely to say that they often or always experience frustrations with having an inadequate salary. More than half said so, 54%. Next were 45% of white women, 38% of men of color, and 28% of white men. In fact, when you looked at the write-in responses to how race and gender had negatively impacted career advancement, the number one response for all the different groups of women of color was around salary, about being paid less than men, than white women, white men, men of color, paid less than folks with the same job. So they were identifying the inequity there. So women of color were also most likely to report opportunities or frustrations around not having enough opportunities for advancement. You see that 49% of them said this was a frequent frustration, followed by 43% of white women, 34% of men of color, and 30% of white men. So here's a quote from a survey respondent who identified as a Latina and said that as a woman, I know that I don't make the same amount of money as my male counterparts. This quote also reflects another theme that we observed in the survey respondents' write-in responses, which was that some women of color who were in mid-level or senior level roles said that they were being assigned tasks were below their level of education and below their experience. So what they were describing was being given implementation or worker bee tasks as opposed to thought leadership or strategy. And some respondents describing assigned assistant type tasks or secretarial tasks, like the woman here who said that she was asked to fetch coffee for the CEO. And here's another quote from a woman of color who participated in a focus group and said that she was paid $20,000 less than her predecessor, who was a white man. And she, of course, had access to this information. And she pointed out that she was doing her previous job, doing the role of executive director, and another, and basically doing 3 times the workload, but the board just wouldn't budge and pay her more. So our third finding has to do with the social landscape of nonprofit organizations. So the women of color who participated in the survey and the focus groups and the interviews described a social landscape within the nonprofit sector that really doesn't support or nurture their leadership. So in some cases, women of color said that they were ignored or invisible within organizations, meaning they had less mentoring and less feedback and evaluations. But then on the other hand, they were hyper-visible, questioned about their decisions and confronted with negative stereotypes. So survey and focus group participants were asked about the support they've received in their careers. And one that we asked about was mentoring, because we know mentors can help folks learn about how to advance to different career opportunities. And we know there's also research that mentoring can help with retention on the job. So survey participants were asked if they had ever had mentors on the job, or if they had ever had mentors outside of the job. And what you see here is that women of color and men of color were the least likely to have had an on-the-job mentor at any nonprofit job. On the other hand, women of color and men of color were the most likely to have had a mentor outside of the job. So what that seems to indicate is that they are compensating for the lack of internal mentoring by seeking out a mentor on their own. And in our focus groups, women of color were really the ones more than any other group to talk about how important mentoring is and how much it was something that they sought out, whether it was from other women of color, that was often the case, but also from folks with a different race and gender, from white women, white men, men of color. Usually these were positive experiences. And we also observed when we looked at the type of organization that the women of color worked for, mentoring was more common for women of color who worked in people of color or immigrant identity-based organizations. 48% of them had mentoring compared to 38% in non-identity-based organizations. And that was echoed in the focus groups, and I'll share a couple of quotes with you. So here's a quote from a survey participant who's a Black woman who identified as a lesbian and said that despite her record, she's never had a single staff person take her under their wing and provide mentoring for her. And she's also never had a supervisor of color. Another aspect of career supports that survey participants were asked about was regular feedback and performance evaluations. So we know that at least performance evaluations are usually required by human resources, feedback less so. So it's interesting to see the small numbers here. And you can observe that women of color and men of color were the least likely to say that they had had regular feedback and performance evaluations. But when we presented that data to the survey, to the focus group participants, what they really noted and what some of the survey participants also wrote in their responses was the downside of the feedback and evaluation process, which is that women of color are often evaluated with a lens that is fraught with bias. And we know that research has shown that performance evaluations lack objectivity and they don't protect people from negative stereotypes. So some survey respondents noted that their performance evaluations were gendered. So they were asked to exhibit more quote unquote feminine leadership styles, or they were critiqued for appearing assertive or aggressive. And we know that from a race and gender perspective, some women of color, such as Black women, are stereotyped as aggressive and punished for displays of emotion, while white women and white men to varying degrees have more freedom to express a more natural range of human emotions. And many survey respondents said, and focus group participants said, that what is presented as feedback is something that's really conveying a lack of trust in their abilities. So you can see this demonstrated in a quote from a focus group participant who said that what she's experienced is not really ongoing feedback, but being policed as a woman of color in a way that her other colleagues, whether it's white women or men in general, aren't policed. And she talked about how disheartening that really is. Another aspect of the social landscape of organizations that we found in the survey was around dealing with genderized racism and stereotypes. So one of the big themes for Asian and Asia Pacific Islander women was about leadership and stereotypes around that. So here's a quote from a participant of the survey who said that she's perceived as an Asian American woman as not being assertive, and managers have questioned her leadership abilities and said that she's too quiet, but then conversely, which I'm sure is very confusing, said that she asks too many questions. So we know that women of color are not a monolith. So we knew that it was important to look at the survey, look at the interviews, focus groups, look at different themes impacting these groups. So I've shared a couple of them with you. And this report has a special chapter with distinct experiences for Asian Pacific Islander women, Black women, Latinx women, transgender women of color, and Native American women. So these observations primarily came from the survey, but for Native American women and for transgender women of color, that was primarily from interviews. So I'll share a couple of the themes for the Native American women and the transgender women of color. So for the transgender women of color, the themes that came up a lot had to do with being tokenized. You can see that reflected in a quote here from a woman who said that at times she feels like she has to be the mascot, that she's expected to go out there and represent trans women and trans people generally and step out there and get that done for the organization. These women also described being confronted with unwelcoming environments in the nonprofit sector, including being misgendered, as well as knowing that the promotions or salaries were being withheld compared to folks who are not trans women of color. For Native American women, they talked about concerns about moving into working in a non-identity-based organizations, and the one who was talked about dealing with the lack of cultural understanding. Native American women who participated in the interviews also talked about uncomfortable experiences working with others in the nonprofit sector. So for example, here's a quote from a woman who said that she's had to deal with stereotypical comments from her colleagues working in the nonprofit sector. And she was really hurt by this, and was something that she was really surprised was continuing to happen. The Native American women also talked about working in partnership with other nonprofit organizations and being asked to represent the community. For example, one person talked about being asked to get a drum group to come to this partnership, you know, really things that she found very stereotypical and unreasonable. So our call to action, which you can find in the report, has to do with these three areas. And the first, of course, has to do with systems change. So leveraging the power of philanthropy. You know, a couple of years ago, only 2% of foundation funding went to organizations that serve and are led by women and girls of color. And we know that's not enough. And some foundations have recognized that too. So for example, the Ms. Foundation, the Novo Foundation, many others have shifted their funding priorities to better support women of color-led organizations. We also know that the nonprofit sector can advocate collectively for things like more funding for the EEOC, even if that means uncomfortably turning the lens on our own practices. Advocate for things like more gender parity laws, which are in effect in just a handful of states. Advocate for things that support economic opportunity for everyone, including women of color, things like higher minimum wages, maybe even a jobs guarantee or universal basic income. Also, organizational change is something that we included in our call to action, which means nonprofits addressing internal biases on the basis of not just race and not just gender, but race and gender together. Training could be a part of that, but it also has to mean that there are consequences for folks who are creating uncomfortable conditions for women of color. And also there has to be some attention paid to salaries and making sure that there's clear transparency around how you get paid a certain amount so that any discrimination is really exposed. And then finally, individual support. So one thing we noticed at the end of every focus group for the women of color and the CEOs of color focus groups was that everyone was passing out their cards, vowing to meet every month. They really appreciated seeing each other and getting to know each other and wanted to support each other. So we think that peer support affinity groups could be a helpful strategy to support women of color working in the sector. But we do want to say it's not a substitute for any of these other things. It's not suddenly going to make women of color get hired to a senior level or executive director role. We know that's not the case, but it's a source of support. So it's a complement to systems change and organizational change as well. So now I really am excited to turn it over to our respondents and get their feedback on some of the things that we've shared so far. So first, I'll ask our respondents, Kelley and Sandra, to unmute yourselves, and I'll ask you to introduce yourselves.
All right. Hey, everybody. Thanks for being on the webinar today. I feel like just by reading the chat, everyone feels equally affirmed as we kind of need a support group coming out of this to figure out what to do next. I'm currently the Executive Director of Planned Parenthood Action Fund. I also do some work consulting with the Management Center. And I just think that everything that was talked about in the report today really is emblematic of the experience that I've had and that I see with other nonprofit groups across the country. And I'm so excited to talk about the structural changes that need to happen, especially the roles that we have as leaders and the directors on the line that have some decision-making authority, and the work that we can do together and interpersonally to kind of build a stronger pipeline for one another. There's so much here that we can really take advantage of as ourselves as leaders that I'm excited to talk about as well.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sandra Gasca-Gonzalez, and I'm equally as excited to be here with you. And thank you for taking the time. I know you all are very busy, and it's very exciting to see the response. Clearly, this is an important topic, and I'm just eager to dive into giving my thoughts. I have a lot of opinions. But just so you know a little bit about myself, I am a vice president at the Annie E. Casey Foundation, and we are a national foundation really focused on building brighter futures for children who are at risk of having poor educational, economic, social, and health outcomes. And my portfolio really focuses on the more deeply involved young people and children and families who are affected by child welfare and juvenile justice, and youth who are aging out of foster care. And so I've been at the foundation for 4 years in this role as a vice president for 6 months. I just got promoted in August. Then prior to that, I was the director of the Jim Casey Youth Opportunities Initiative, which does focus on young people aging out of foster care and finding ways to build their relationships, their resources, and their opportunities so that they can thrive. And you know, I've been around, I've worked in a lot of different places. I have 22 years of experience, mostly in child welfare and mental health. I have been in roles where I have focused on child protective services, so actually removing children from their families, working to reunify them, working with recruitment of foster parents, and getting kids adopted. I've done the whole spectrum. I started as an outpatient therapist and worked my way up. And I'll talk a little bit about that later, but I've actually worked I was born and raised in Arizona, spent my high school years in Texas, but have worked and lived in Kansas, Nebraska, Arizona, and Washington, D.C. So I have quite a range of all kinds of stories I could share about structural racism and discrimination, and what I've learned from that. So thanks again for having us. I'm excited.
Thank you. So the first question to both of you is, how do the findings resonate with your experiences and observations?
I'll jump in. I think that it resonates in a really strong way with me. And I think that's why I think as we kind of go through the research, the first kind of mode or the first kind of emotion that comes up for me is actually feeling quite frustrated. You know, similar to Sandra, I've had experiences all across the country. I grew up on the south side of Chicago. I grew up Black, and I grew up female as like core parts of my identity coming into the world. And I think that number one, the field of nonprofit wasn't something that was kind of in my purview. But then when it became the thing that I had to do because I understood the kind of experience that I could offer that would really be transformative in changing people's lives, then to get into the field and understand that in so many ways, the organizations and the nonprofit structure itself, the nonprofit industrial complex as we call it, does not satisfy the values of the kind of work that we're trying to do to really get free, is an incredibly frustrating feeling. I also think that, especially when we're talking about leadership, I started off as an organizer in Iowa before I made my way over here to the East Coast at the National Office of Planned Parenthood. And it's just so clear that for us to kind of move as women of color, as folks of color, there are certain rules that you've got to learn in order to operate in the nonprofit world, right? How do I show up and be aggressive, but not be too aggressive, right? How do I show up and be compelling and make sure that I'm leaning into everything that's authentic about me without being tokenized? And that's a delicate dance to learn, I think, for us as individuals. But then when we get into leadership, I think the responsibility that we have becomes even greater. Two things that really stuck out for me that I just want to note. The biggest one to me has been around feedback, especially as a Black woman in the workplace. The resistance of folks to give me meaningful feedback when I was coming up in my career, or waiting to give me feedback only until it was at like, ooh, this is a dire circumstance because I don't feel comfortable giving you feedback along the way, is actually one of the biggest barriers I see to folks being able to advance in their career. Because we know feedback comes in all kinds of ways, but also it's like the number one way that people are learning and growing on the job. So if they're not getting that, there's so many other things that they're missing. The second thing that really stands out to me that you noted is this idea that leadership has a tendency to mirror itself, right? Particularly with your mentorship principle. And one of the things that we say at the Management Center that I think comes from similar studies and research is that the way bias shows up isn't necessarily hostility towards people that are different from me, it's favorability towards folks that are like me. So as long as leadership looks like itself, the mentorship opportunities will continue to replicate that. And we end up in this system that becomes challenging particularly for folks of color to break through. So I think that, you know, to your point, the interventions have to be made at the individual level, but really at the systemic level as well.
So I just want to say that Kelley and I did not prepare together, and I have very similar responses to the reaction that I had. You know, I'm reading some of the comments as you all are typing, and the one thing that I just want to validate for everyone is that everyone's journey is unique. And that is because there isn't a roadmap for women of color at this point in time to rise. Everybody has sort of done it their own way, but I think that there are enough women who have advanced that we can start formulating what those lessons learned are and start capitalizing on that so that we don't keep repeating those mistakes over and over again. And so I just want to answer the question in terms of my reaction. I've been reflecting on the first question that was posed in the PowerPoint, which is about the training programs for developing leaders of color and why that doesn't seem to be pumping out like more leaders of color in nonprofits. And so my reaction to that is really based on my own experience. And there's two things that I wanted to say about that, and very similar to what Kelley said. In my own experience, I had to recognize immediately that no one was going to give me a leg up or a handout. And I wasn't angry about it because it was an acknowledgement that if I wanted to be a leader, then I had to move through life understanding that and keeping my emotions in check. And trust me, I learned that the hard way because I did not always keep my emotions in check. What I did was that I started to use whatever frustration about the whole situation that I had, and I channeled it to becoming a sense of urgency around my work towards results. And once I started to do that, no one could touch me because I was achieving my results. And then the second thing that I did was to leverage my culture and background of a blue-collar, hardworking group of people that doesn't scare from tough jobs. So I made it my life's mission to take the tough jobs that no one wanted to do. There's always that job that no one wants to go live in rural Kansas. No one wants to take that high-risk public job that you might end up in the paper, and for good reason. But I told myself, you know, I'm not going to shy away from these challenges. I'm going to be marginalized and oppressed anyway, so I'm going to do it, and I'm going to do it with love and compassion and not anger. And so I kept my emotions in check and focused on the end game, which for me was improving the lives of children and families. And what that did was built my leverage for wage negotiations, because they were like, oh, this woman is willing to try stuff. So that's just part of my own personal journey. But to answer the question about these training programs, going back to that, the reason they're not being as successful as I think people want is because we don't have a way to apply what we learn. And it's simply not enough for us to build ourselves up and get out of our own way, emotionally speaking. We have to work on a system and organizational structures that actually allows us and seeks and promotes people of color into leadership positions, which sadly, as we saw from the report, still isn't happening. So just to wrap up my reflection, I just think that as women of color who are making progress in careers, it's our job to really open the doors, to bust down the walls, and to bring other women of color up with us.
Thanks so much, both of you. I'm going to skip to a different question, which is, what organizational strategies or changes have you seen that have worked to help women of color overcome some of the challenges that we identified in the report?
Do you want to jump in first on that one, Sandra?
Yes, the organizational challenges. Go ahead, Kelley.
All right, sounds good. A few things. So I'm going to talk about at the organizational level first. And I feel like there are some things that are happening systemically that are actually, I do see the field kind of evolving and changing over time. But as you've already said, the change is not happening fast enough. And when we're doing good things, we've got to start to institutionalize it, call it best practice, and repeat. So I think at the institutional level, some of the things that I've found to be helpful: one, building in mentorship as a real thing in a program, not something that some folks get access to and some don't based on interpersonal relationships. And I also think that that's true with role and job assignments, right? Having structures for managers in place to help them reduce the ways that bias shows up in the workplace. I think I saw someone say it in the chat that the problem usually for a lot of us isn't that folks aren't talking about race and gender. The problem is that we're not applying any of those lessons to the practice of how we do our work, the practice of how we make our decisions, the practice of how we budget and we hire. So I do think this element of kind of applied equity and finding systems and practices at your organization that you can institutionalize is helpful and important. One of those can be mentorship opportunities. The other kind of level I think is key is really with like donors and funders and foundations. I think that when women of color come into executive leadership, oftentimes there's a new world that we have to navigate. Oftentimes it can be the fundraising world, which doesn't always look like us and can be a new venue. And there has to be some room for folks to take creative risks, to get startup funding to incubate their organization, including unrestricted dollars that will actually help towards building the foundations of their programs, that will allow them to get past that year 1 and 2, that sometimes is that critical period to really get the foundation right and build new funds, new sources of income streams. And I think figuring that piece out, particularly with our partners in the donor world, the foundation world, is going to be really, really important for leaders that are coming through the pipeline there to be successful once they get into their first CEO or executive director leadership role. I'll also say, we see in the tech field a lot that they're incentivized to take risks, right? Whereas, on the nonprofit side, it's not the case. I think that sometimes once we get those executive leaders having constructive ways to take risks and have funding to fail even can be an important way to expand the scope of our work and help us to really leverage all that Sandra said, ensuring that the ideas, the experiences that we bring to the table are not just us showing up and as the face of the organization, but us showing up as people who have ideas that can be implemented, they can be modified, and they can be iterated to ultimately get us to where we need to go, right? A world that's more equitable, a world that's more just. I'll also say the last thing I think has been, especially for my organization, one of the things that's been really important is that in the course of the work, there is accountability towards equity. Oftentimes we talk about, goal setting, or you do that annual strategic plan, and there's that bullet point that says, we're going to do ... And then the last bullet is, and we're going to do it in an equitable way that builds our leadership. But that bullet usually doesn't have any meat behind it, any staff, any money, any resources, or really any measurable outcomes that we're going to hold ourselves accountable to. So I do think that that's another opportunity to be serious about how we are going to make equity a part of the work. We're going to measure our achievement against real outcomes, and we're going to iterate moving forward. Because as folks have already said, particularly Sandra, I love how you named this, the value of having people of color at the table is not that the table looks more diverse, it's so that we're actually getting better solutions that can impact the communities that we serve in a more sustainable way. That's where we're trying to go. So I think that these ways of finding concrete opportunities to apply equity and not allow our race silence to have us to believe that we're being race neutral, as Race Forward says often, but to really push ourselves there is another opportunity. The last thing I'll say, I think, is on the individual level. I think that the support groups are really important, and having spaces and opportunities to learn from not just people in your field, but outside of your field, folks of color, women of color, can be helpful, because we have to start to construct what can paths look like so that folks, the interns in our field, the new folks can actually envision, wow, this is what it looks like to construct a path to leadership. And some of what we've done, the folks who are on this call, it's not by accident that you've ended up where you are. It's by hard work and understanding those untold things that are happening within your office environment that have allowed you to succeed. So I do think on the personal level, there is some agency that we all have, especially as you're moving up in your career, to make the path that you've gotten to leadership more transparent to others, so that they understand at least this is one strategy of not only how to survive, but how to thrive, and seeing your identity that you bring to the table and those experiences and skills as one of your key assets, right, in actually driving your career forward.
You know, I have a lot of thoughts about organizational changes, and I know that we always say that leadership can happen from any level positionally in the organization, and I believe that. I also know that how the CEO, how the leadership values the whole equity, whether it's gender equity, racial equity, really matters. And if the CEO is not willing to put a stake in the ground to say and to walk the walk around moving beyond tokenism and just having little diversity committees to address part of what the issues are, that's not real. That's not the real deal. And you know, I've been fortunate over the last 4 years to work at a place that we're not perfect, but we actually had a CEO, a white man, older guy, just retired, who said, you know what, it's not good enough. If we're going to get to our results, we have to get real about racial and ethnic equity and inclusion and figure out how we operationalize that throughout all of our work. And so we literally went through a very painful process of identifying where our grants were going, what our diversity makeup was of our staff, what our board membership looked like. And I know those things may sound very basic, but when you're actually in the throes of doing it, it's very painful, and it brings up biases and things that you didn't even realize existed in your organization. And once you know, you have to do something differently. And so, you know, part organizationally is once you start looking at things, you have to take action to address them. You can't just leave them hanging, because that just creates a whole morale issue there. I think the other thing that organizations have to do along those lines is also to take a position on whether they're going to be an anti-racist organization or if they're just going to play in the let's be cultural sensitive spectrum of the work. And you know, being anti-racist means you actually show up and you change your practices, your policies. You don't celebrate Columbus Day. And there are a number of organizations that are really starting to figure out how to share power with employees, especially people of color, to be able to really shift how the organizational culture is. And I think those are the things that will really help women of color overcome some of these challenges.
Great. I also want to ask you, what are some of the system-wide changes that you think could help women of color advance and thrive? So thinking about philanthropy, public policy, what do you think would be effective?
You want me to go first, Kelley, or you want to go? Okay. So one of the things, you know, I'm multitasking. I'm watching the chat at the same time. It's very distracting and also very powerful. But I'm thinking about the things that can be done, especially by philanthropy, is to actually invest in building networks for women of color that have these support systems that actually fund gatherings around things like the topics that are on here about wage negotiations, just all the topics that are coming up in the chat group. I think that that's one thing that is very important, that investing in networks. And I'm fortunate to be a part of a couple of networks that have actually helped me work through a lot of the challenges that I've had just trying to get through life. I think that the other thing systemically we need to do as we're working on tearing down structural racism is defining the role of the white ally in the context of philanthropic leadership. And what I mean by that is that there are white people who are a part of this movement that we often leave behind. And we debate this a lot at our organization, because people feel like, well, it's not our responsibility to bring the white people along. It's their responsibility to get with the program. Well, I mean, if there's people who want to do something, want to help, and they don't know how, it's an opportunity, if we want it, to actually educate them to help create this movement and ultimately help tear down some of these racist structures that were put in place by them. And then the other thing I would just say is changing the way tables are set and run for decision making, including community members, sharing power with community, people who are a part of the community. That is a role that we're taking on within philanthropy, and we should always promote that. So those are just a few of the things that can come right to mind for me.
Yeah, I want to kind of double click on that. We got to make sure that having a fluency in applying tools of equity is not an optional thing for anyone on staff, right? We don't do well if our white folks on staff don't understand that. We certainly don't do well when we've got folks of color that are elevated to leadership and they don't understand that. So making sure that that's a priority across the board for organizations can be a real solid intervention. I think I named some of the points about working with foundations and with donors that are helpful before, having some support, especially unrestricted funding support for new executive directors and leaders of color to help build the foundation, figuring out ways to encourage healthy risk-taking through donor dollars, I think is another really important thing and opportunity that folks have. I also think in addition to kind of networks for staff, helping to build a pipeline of board leadership and board diversity can also be really helpful. One of the challenges that is sometimes present is that if the boards are lacking diversity, then the folks that they pick and the networks that they have may also lack the same diversity that's necessary to pick the leaders. So I think that that's another place that we should really be digging in to kind of figure out how to support this work. And I also think, to be real, to do this work as a woman of color, you're doing minimum 2 jobs, right? You're doing your job, and then you're existing as a person of color within the workplace as your second job that you've just got to kind of figure out that is equally taxing and grueling. I do think that we have to figure out what are best practices for healing, best practices for support that will allow us not just to get to these roles, but to be able to sustain ourselves and our families and our communities in the practice of these roles. Some of that even means, thinking about how we do work-life integration or work-life balance differently. And once you're in a leadership position, to Sandra's point, oftentimes the preferences of the leader express themselves to the rest of the team. So if I'm working 24 hours a day, my team's going to be working 24 hours a day. And what ways can we actually model more holistic practices that will support folks of color in sustaining their work over time? Because I think that's equally important as it is for us to get the jobs. It's about sustaining our impact and our ability to drive the work once we're there.
Great. And one last, give you an opportunity to share one quick tidbit, anything that you didn't get a chance to mention that you would love to share, or if you want to mention how, if we address some of these things, nonprofit organizations or the sector can be stronger.
Here, I'll kick us off on this one, Sandra. I just want to say that I think that sometimes these conversations can be frustrating, but ultimately they are incredibly powerful, because the more that we can figure this out, the more that we can learn together, the change that will be expressed in the world is tenfold. And I can say it just through the campaigns that we've run. There's a difference between the numbers that you see around health disparities and actually having healthy communities. And that difference, that push for us to move towards equity and health for communities has come from making sure that we have the right voices at the table that are driving and pushing an agenda that's not just looking at outcomes today, but it's actually taking a generational mindset to how do I make sure that the next generation is healthier? And that's got to be informed and led by especially folks of color and people that have experienced a lot of what our folks are experiencing. And I'll also say that I think for me, the power is really between us and with the community. There's 577 folks on this line. That's a heck of a support group to get us started. And we are a resilient people, and this is not the hardest of the challenges that we've been through, but if we can continue to learn and continue to grow, I think the outcomes are great. I also think that we're at a unique point where organizations have more pressure externally and internally to do better, and oftentimes don't have the path. And I think with resources like this, we can start to articulate what the problem is, how it's impacting our overall investments, and start to articulate a better path forward. And I guess I'll close with just Lucille Clifton's quote. I'm sure folks have heard it. She used to be the poet laureate of Maryland. She used to say, "Come celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me, and has failed. And they ain't gonna win today. So I'm excited to continue this work and drive forward and find more paths to leadership for even more folks like the people on this call.
I would just want to emphasize what one of the findings was in the presentation around mentoring and how we don't have mentors in our workplace. And I would say, forget that. Go find your own mentors outside of the workplace. Half the time you're going to get better feedback because they don't have a dog in the fight. They are actually going to be loving to you and telling you your blind spots because they don't work with you. So don't let that be a barrier. Create a book club that may or may not involve a book. It might involve wine. And the whole point around even getting together and gathering is to be in fellowship, and some of that healing comes from that. You can do that. You're doing this online right now. We can see, I think there's some group I'm going to join at some point. And so we don't have to wait for anyone to do it for us. If anything that we have proven as women and women of color is that we don't wait for anybody to tell us when we can do something, when we need to do something. We do it. And I just think that if we are able to really coalesce around our own power and find ways to come together, either in small groups, large groups, whatever, I think that is the way that we're going to make ultimate sustainable change.
Thank you so much. There are an amazing number of people here who've been sharing their contact info, just like I said at the focus groups, and we'll be sure to capture that for folks who want that shared with each other. So we're running out of time, so unfortunately it doesn't look like we can take the Q&A, but I will share my contact information. So if you have a question and you would like us to address it, please feel free to email me. I do want to quickly share our research agenda for the Building Movement Project. A lot of this is related to what was shared earlier. Some folks are asking the chat about executive directors, so we are going to release a report on executive directors and CEOs of the nonprofit sector in the coming months. We're also doing a deep dive in majority people of color cities, looking at some of these questions. And a big one is we're doing a resurvey this summer 2019. So there are over 500 people, close to 600 in this webinar. We had 1,300 register. So we hope that all of you, if you're still working in the nonprofit sector this summer, please take the survey. The more data we have, the better our reports will be. So please look out for that and fill out the survey. We want to see how things have changed in the last 3 years. And then finally, BNP is working on building an organizational assessment, which will be a free tool that nonprofits can use to get a snapshot of internal issues and practices and help determine how to pursue a race and gender equity journey. It would be something that staff and leaders and board members in the nonprofit organization can fill out. We're pilot testing it right now, and we hope to release it in 2020. So as I mentioned before, please do stay connected. If you have a story that you want to share about being a woman of color in the nonprofit sector, our Twitter and Facebook handles are here at Building Movement. Use our hashtags WOC Equity, Remake the Table. You could also use our existing one, Race to Lead, as well. And again, if there's a question that we didn't get to or you have an idea about collaboration, you can feel free to email me. My email information is on the screen. As I mentioned, we will send this presentation, a link to it, out to you. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to our respondents. Thank you to Kelley and Sandra. Thank you to Noelia Mann, our operations and communications coordinator, who's rapidly answering your questions and comments in the chat. And thank you to all of you for coming here today. Thank you so much and have an excellent day.